So you'll recall in the previous lesson that we dealt with inductive reasoning. And so with this lesson, what we're going to deal with is deductive reasoning. And so first, let's just talk about the three things that you should be able to do by the end of this video. So one of them is using deductive reasoning to validate or invalidate an argument, use the law of detachment, and then also use the law of syllogism. So these are two different laws that help you in terms of using deductive reasoning. So starting with deductive reasoning, now remember with inductive was using a specific example to back up what you were saying, where deductive is using a fact, a rule, a definition, property, and those things to reach logical conclusions from given statements. With these types of reasonings, you're determining whether something is valid. And so it isn't necessarily true all the time, but that it's logically correct, that it makes sense based on the statements and what follows. The law of detachment is if P implies Q is true, and remember again, this is the word implies. So if P implies Q is true and P is true, then Q is true. So it kind of follows a whole a law, and it's literally detaching the statement, and I'll show you kind of how that works. And then we have the law of syllogism, which is if P implies Q and Q implies R are true statements, then P implies R is a true statement. And so we're going to use these patterns in order to use our deductive reasoning or determine whether something is valid. So let's go ahead and use the law of detachment. So here is a full example of how the law of detachment works. So if a car is out of gas, then it will not start. And so then the second statement is Sarah's car is out of gas. So here's what I want you to notice. First of all, here's our P statement. A car is out of gas. And here is our Q statement. It will not start. So this is P, and then this one over here is Q. So remember, law of detachment was P implies Q, P, and then Q, okay? And so you'll notice now that this Sarah's car is out of gas. This matches P. So it's literally pulling the statement apart. So this one is P implies Q. This is P, which means in order for this to be a valid argument, this would have to be Q, and it is. Car will not start, so here's Q. So check, check, check. It all works for this law of detachment. So now what I'm going to do is use this and now determine whether this is an argument or a valid argument, and if it's not, then we're going to give a counterexample. So using the same process, if you stay up late, then you will be tired, right? So P implies Q. Then we have our next statement, which is you are tired, which matches Q, right? So right now, it's not really following that law. We've got our P implies Q statement, and then we don't have P, right? We have Q instead. So let's go ahead and look at this last part right here. The conclusion is that you stayed up late. Well, it's not only does it not follow this whole law and the pattern that it should, but if you think about it, if you stay up late, then you'll be tired. You're tired. That doesn't necessarily mean that you stayed up late. Maybe you just didn't sleep well. Maybe, so let's say maybe you were sick. Maybe, you just, like I said earlier, like you just didn't sleep well. So all you're doing is just coming up with this would be your counterexample, just coming up with something to show why this wouldn't necessarily be a true statement, other than the fact that it doesn't follow the law. Okay, so now here's another one, and this one's a little bit different. So we're determining again. And so if the temperature drops below 32 degrees, it may snow. Okay, so if the temperature drops below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, it may snow. Okay, so we've got our P implies Q. All right, and then here we have that the temperature did not drop below 32 degrees on Monday. right? So even though this actually has this not right here, what we're looking for is, look at this next statement. Does it have to do with snowing? Yes, it does. So it did not snow on Monday. Okay, well, even though this doesn't match identically to the law, it still is valid because it makes sense. These two statements go hand in hand. It didn't go below 32, so that means that it didn't snow. So that does in fact follow the law of detachment. Okay, so now using the law of syllogism. So this one is already written out, all three statements totally complete. So if an angle measures between 90 and 100 degrees, then it is obtuse. So again, I'll come back and we will highlight. So if So if an angle measures between 90 and 180 degrees, then it is obtuse. Okay. And actually, I don't really want to include the then, just the it is obtuse part. Okay. And then we have our next statement, which you'll notice is if an angle is obtuse. So it repeats from the previous statement. So here it repeats. And then we have a new statement of, then you'll notice that if an angle measures between 90 and 180 degrees, what's going on? Okay, there we go. So that repeats again, so I'm using the same colors, and then it is not acute, and that repeats again. So the law of syllogism goes like this. This would be your P statement, implies Q. This one is Q implies R. And this one is P implies R. And so that does in fact follow the law of syllogism. Okay, so now let's look at using this and determining whether we can draw a valid conclusion. So remember, we want to follow the pattern of P implies Q, Q implies R, and then P implies R. So can we come up with something to fit this pattern? So let's go ahead and use the highlighting for the same idea. So a shape is a square. So if a shape is a square, then our next statement is it has 4 right angles. So we've got our P implies Q. All right, so we've got that. Now what we need is for our Q to repeat down here. A shape has 4 right angles. Awesome. That is Q. And then we have something about it being a rectangle, which is perfect because that is different than our original P statement. So we have Q implies R. So we need to now write this statement right here. Okay, so we have our P statement, which would be if a shape is a square, then, and now we use our R, it is a rectangle. And that would be your valid conclusion because it follows that law. All right, and that's it. There we go. That's how we use our law of syllogism, our law of detachment. And so make sure you have these things written down and you're ready with any questions that you may have. And actually, you know what? Let me jump back to this one. Sorry, I know I had you thinking you were done. That was my fault. I want you to do just one more and kind of see why this one wouldn't work. And so with this one, it's if you interview for a job, then you will wear a suit. So let's go ahead and highlight. So interview for a job, then you will wear a suit. So P implies Q. And remember, our order is P implies Q, Q implies R, P implies R. All right, and so then let's look at our next one. We have if you interview for a job. So now we've got this yellow again. So we've got P, and then update your resume. And so we've got our R. Okay. So this did not follow the law. It followed P implies Q. It did not follow this. So therefore, we can't make a valid conclusion. So it is invalid. And so what would be reasoning for that? Well, if you interview for a job, you'll wear a suit. Okay, maybe you will. If you interview for a job, then you'll update your resume. Maybe, oops, let's fix that. Maybe your resume is already updated. You know, if you're doing lots of interviews all at one time, you don't really need to update your resume because it's already ready to go. So that would be maybe just one argument for why this wouldn't be true or necessarily valid. Okay, now we're done, I promise. So make sure you have it all written down and come with questions.